Greetings, diners, and welcome to another edition of the Collapse Cafe here on the Doomstead Diner. I am joined by my good friends, Yuko Barty, who runs the blog Resource Crisis, and who is a member of the Club of Rome, and took part in the original Age of Limits study, going back as far as 1972, I think it was. And then we have Steve Ludlam, an old friend who runs the blog Economic Undertow, and who has the interests in the economic end of the collapse that is ongoing, but of course many other interests as well that he details in his blog. And he's been taking a bit of a break from blogging, but with the current Greek crisis ongoing, I think it has re-energized him. He dropped on a recent blog with that in mind. And then we have Gail Tverberg, a former actuary who runs the blog Our Finite World, and who was an editor on the Oil Drum for many years before that, has been covering peak oil phenomenon from the energy perspective for the most part over these years. And our focus in our discussion today is going to be what just about everybody is paying attention to now, which is the possibility of a Grexit, a Greek exit from the Eurozone. They just held a referendum. Basically, the results came in just minutes ago or hours ago in terms of the first results from the districts, the exit polling. And the last I checked, with something like 60% of the precincts tallied, the oxy vote or no vote for accepting the proposals of the Troika, which includes the IMF, the European Union, and the ECB, the European Central Bank, not accepting their proposals, was 61% to 39% at that time. So basically, it was a resounding defeat for the forces of globalism and the people who are trying to make a federated European Union, a consolidation of the political and economic controls over that society, and a victory, if you will, for those who want to maintain sovereignty and independence in their individual countries. So that vote has tremendous significance across the board, and I'm going to go through each of our panelists and get some of their preliminary thoughts on that vote, how they think things might play out, why that vote might have come to pass, and so forth, from their various perspectives. And each of them has, I think, a little bit different perspective to give here in this. Hugo himself lives in Europe. He is a professor at the University of Firenze in Italy, and Italy, of course, is possibly on the next step in the ladder here of countries that will have pressure of this of a very similar sort that has been ongoing in Greece. So, Hugo, you want to give us your thoughts on the vote in Greece and how that's playing out generally?
Well. Everybody is discussing this. There is so many things are being said. Really, I don't know what I could add on this thing, because people discussing financing the euro, the drachma, how we go out of the euro, and the financial problems. And everybody in Italy was saying the same. I have to say, we want to have the euro is very unfashionable right now in Europe. Many people seem to think that if we leave the euro, we go back to our old currencies, then everything will back the way it was, and we will be much happier and richer, and all problems will be solved. I am a bit skeptical about such an idea, as you may imagine. I am no financial expert, and if you allow me, I tend to doubt that even exists such a thing as a financial expert, whatever that means. But I look at what people call the fundamentals, and the situation is bad. The situation is bad because the economies of Southern Europe are not producing anymore things which can be sold. The Southern European nations are living right now mainly on tourism, but especially Greece. Greece is one of the worst cases. They are not manufacturing anymore so much as they would do before. So if you don't sell your products outside the country, then you cannot fix your balance. There is a little problem because they say, okay, this is the point, right? Okay, so we devalue our currency by going back to the drachma or to the lira in Italy or to the peso in Spain, and then our products will cost less, and so we export again. We build up our industry again. But in my opinion, there is a little problem here. This recipe, say I devalue my currency and then my products sell more, worked up to a certain time in the past, because if you devalue your currency, it is true that your products may cost less, but also to you, the mineral commodities, the natural resources that you have to import, they will cost more. So it's not so obvious that today this recipe will work. And I'm afraid that Greece will be, what you call that, the guinea pig, the canary of the mine, whatever you have. They will experiment whether this recipe still works or not. Because if it doesn't, then it is very, very bad for Greece and for the Greek citizens.
Yeah, there's no doubt that you run into that problem on the currency devaluation end, and in most particular, when you talk about mineral commodities that the Greeks need to import in, it's the energy that is necessary to be producing stuff on an industrial scale, and then on the labor level, they have to compete against very, very cheap labor countries, places like China and Pakistan, and some South American countries, Mexico, etc. So so it definitely is not clear by any means that by a devaluation of their own currency that will help them very much on the economic front. Steve, you want to continue on there from your perspective on why the Greeks voted the way they did, and what alternatives and possibilities they might have for handling the problems that they're facing right now?
Well, the Greeks elected the Syriza government for the purpose of repudiating their loans that they money that they borrowed from banks in Germany and France. The debt is largely odious. In other words, none of the money went to the Greeks themselves. It was just recycled through the banking system to bail out the banks in these countries. So they don't want to pay. They don't. There's no reason for them to pay. And what you have is excuse my French, a pissing contest between the banks and their intermediaries. The people, like Joe and Christine Lagarde and some of the politicians, and the politicians agree.
Steve, your audio
We don't hear you.
People are
bad.
Steve is gone.
Steve is gone. Yeah.
No, he's back.
Yeah. Steve, I'm going to move over to Gail for a bit while you're having your issues over there. Maybe your audio will clear up and we can come back to you. Let me move over to Gail. And Gail, you want to tell us what your thoughts are on how the Greek political situation might be related to their energy woes and how their monetary system and energy problems are intertwined. I know that's more or less more of your focus.
Yes. Oh, I guess I better put you back on the screen that has the same one as the. Let me move this back here, so I don't have to look the opposite direction of what I'm talking to you. Anyhow, well, I think part of the issue in Greece is exactly the same one in Puerto Rico, and Puerto Rico isn't tied to the dollar except for the minimum wage. You know, what happens is that they have an energy mix that includes a lot of oil. So it makes it a high-cost energy mix, which in a sense is part of the reason why it costs a lot for the people in Greece to live. So this is one of the reasons why it's hard to readjust. You know, if you had an energy mix that was a cheaper energy mix that was based mostly on coal, it would affect both the cost of making the goods and also the cost of living for the people living in the country. If everything is powered by coal, it's fairly cheap to make a public transit system, for example. So this is the reason why it's very difficult to fix the situation. And when I look at the situation, it's not just Greece that has a very high percentage of oil in its energy mix, making it an expensive energy mix. Cyprus does too. I just mentioned Puerto Rico. It has a very, very high percentage of oil in its energy mix. But, you know, Italy and Portugal and Spain and Ireland aren't all that far behind either. So all of these countries that have a lot of oil in their energy mix tend to be the same countries that are having these financial difficulties.
Well, you know, I think that the energy aspect of it, the energy equation, has significantly affected the economies of these countries. But I also have, you know, some issues with the levels of debt that have been foisted on these countries. I know around 2006, I believe I read the Greek debt was something like $20 billion. But then in the course, and that's the debt they accumulated over the course of basically the entire period from the end of World War II until 2006, right? $20 billion in debt. But then in the course of 8 years, somehow they got loaded with another $300 billion in debt. So today their debt is at $320 billion. Now, are you telling me that in 6 years they spent $300 billion themselves? No, I don't think so. There's hanky-panky that's been going on insofar as how the debt has been structured and what the IMF has done and those things. So, you know, I really have some suspicions about the way that this debt has been structured and the way in which the debt was shifted from the private interests to the public payroll. You know, all of these bailouts have been bailouts of basically Northern European banks, not of the Greek people. It's even been admitted by the IMF and the World Bank, I think, as well, that, or at least leaked out, that they were quite aware that they were not saving the Greeks, but rather saving the banks from going belly up in 2008. And that's where the majority of this debt actually comes from. Steve, I see you're back. So let's see if your audio is coming in a little better now, and you might be able to pick up where you left off. Steve?
A picture of his hands.
There you go. Okay, Steve is having the serious issues here today on the audio end. And the video too, it seems. So anyway, we have that aspect of how the banking system is insinuated in here into this mix, and how that seems to be exacerbating the problems. Hugo, you got any thoughts on how banking is fitting into this mix? And
Well, you should not ask me about banks, but I would add
everybody's got
something.
an opinion, Hugo.
Yeah, everybody's got an opinion. I have an opinion that banks are evil, and their followers of Sauron, they're one of the company of the ring, and their managers are monsters. So they usually show you a human face, but when they go back home, they take the plastic face off, and they are lizard people. But apart from this opinion of mine, I wanted to add something to what Gail just said, which is she nailed the problem, I think, and I would like to offer another aspect of the same problem. She said correctly that the countries which have the most problems are those which consume the most petroleum, crude oil. But also, if you look at the data, you will see also, if you take a ratio of the amount of fossil energy consumed, which is mostly imported in Greece, Spain, Portugal, and Italy, all these countries, they produce a little oil, but very little. If you take a ratio, you will see that the ratio is high in comparison to Northern Europe. That is, the economies are inefficient. The GDP of Italy, for instance, is smaller than that of Switzerland for the same amount of energy consumed. So our economy is less efficient than that of Switzerland because we are less efficient. We waste more energy, we do things in a less efficient way, and many things like that. And if you compare to Greece, Greece is much worse than Italy. So they're very inefficient. And I think this is one of the reasons, also the mix, but this is just the amount of fossil fuels consumed in comparison to the GDP, then this is one of the reasons why Greece is the weak link of the whole chain, the weakest link of all Europe. But all European countries are more or less in the same conditions. After Greece, there is Portugal, then there is Spain and Italy, more or less at the same level, and then France, and then you go north. For some reason, the northern countries are more efficient than the southern countries. It has to be because of the heat, I suppose. I can show you my thermometer here. We have right now in my room 27 degrees centigrade, but only because I have an air conditioner here that I bought this morning, because we never saw such a situation. We have 36 degrees centigrade out there. It's horrible. But anyway, we keep burning fossil fuels because we cannot stop doing that.
Well, that aspect of the current heat wave running across Europe is definitely another factor that we can consider here in this discussion. I read that it's 40 degrees C, or like 104 degrees Fahrenheit for Americans not familiar with the Celsius scale. And they're basically cooking over there right now. And so, of course, basic survival in that type of environment for any protracted length of time requires some form of cooling, especially for older people who are more sensitive, very young infants and so forth. So, this is a life-threatening situation that's going on right now all across Europe. In terms of the efficiencies and so forth of these various countries, I was talking about that with my friend Romer, who's up here visiting with me in Alaska right now. And, I think it's a lot of that is cultural, because GDP ends up getting measured because how efficient your whole tax structure is, and how well the money gets moved and recycled through the system. Because the money, of course, is a waste generating process as it circulates through the system, and it represents the energy, and it represents the energy flow. Um, so the Northern European countries, culturally, are they tend to be more obedient as a societies. They tend to follow orders better. I mean, everybody knows the Germans, right? Let me see your papers. And so that those efficiencies are there. Whereas you get down to Southern Europe, and I mean, I interrailed through all Southern Europe several times during my youth, and it's the same everywhere. Everybody, looks the other way as far as taxation is concerned. Everybody is trying to avoid responsibilities within the society and so forth, and so that contributes to the inefficiencies in the total system on the energy level. That's just an opinion, of course. Steve, all right, let's
Yes.
try it again. You look better this time. You look like you actually have a decent connection. So you can
Well,
either pick up
well,
where
can
we
you
are
hear,
now, or go back to that original question I asked you.
well, can you hear what I'm saying?
Yes,
Yes.
you're clear now.
Okay, that's I'm having internet connection problems. I've been having them for a while, so I'm not going to get into it anymore. I mean,
Well,
there's a couple of things that are going on. I mean, I've looked at this before too. Along with Gail and Hugo. I mean, the only countries that actually produce petroleum in Europe are Norway and Denmark, and of course Russia. So unsurprisingly, the only countries that don't have finance crisis right now are Norway and Denmark. Now, Russia has a finance crisis, but it's because it's embroiled in a war, unnecessary war, and they've kind of annoyed a lot of their customers. I don't know how that's going to work out, but these other European countries, they all import a huge amount of resources, petroleum and whatnot. And, they don't really have any way to pay for it except by exporting. Germany can export automobiles, but automobiles don't have any value. They don't really do anything for the person that buys the car. They just drive around for fun, going from gas station to gas station, filling up the car and just drive around some more, fill up the car and drive around some more and drop. They do that until the car breaks down. So at a very fundamental level, all of the countries are in Europe, and this includes the United States and developing countries like China. All these countries are bankrupt because they really don't have any way to retire any of their loans. They can't obviously put any resources back in the ground. All they can do is use the resources faster or slower. And as such, eventually the resources run out. Then you have to allocate them. So what's happening in Europe right now, starting with Greece, and Latvia and Slovenia and some of the other kind of weird countries that nobody pays attention to, they're being excluded from the resource stream. And resources continue to flow toward the center. So the Germans want their stuff, and the French want their stuff, and they actually have power. They can turn the screws on a little country like Greece and say, well, you're not going to get anything. We're going to get we're going to get your share. So basically, that's the theater that's playing out in these countries. It's not just Greece. I mean, there's other countries that have finance problems. I mean, the Balkans have gone, they've got a war. The Baltic states are emptied out by Washington consensus politics. They decided, I think it was Estonia, they want to get into Euro, so they will do anything. They basically exported all their young people out of the country. And, I mean, this is not something that a sensible government does. I mean, it's like, all these countries can't export their working people to other countries. Where are they all going to go, right? I mean, all the countries have problems anyway. I mean, Germany has problems. It's not the same kind of problems as like Italy or Spain, but it's not coming up flowers in Germany either. And if there's a default, and we got a technical default in Greece. you got a whole list of countries that are going to do the same thing. I mean, there's absolutely no way that a country like Spain and Italy can pay their debts. I mean, the numbers are simply too big. And, you know, some kind of adjustment has to be made, one way or the other. And this is a point I was trying to make earlier, that the Syriza government in Greece was elected specifically to repudiate these debts. They are unpayable. You can't even borrow. I mean, this is how, if you look at a graph of debt, the debt increases exponentially. Okay? At some point, the number just gets too big. And the reason it expands exponentially is you pay off the debt by borrowing more. You borrow the interest, you borrow more principal, you borrow more so that you can get the stuff that you want to get besides. Well, the numbers get too big. And that's what's happening right now.
Sono un'intervista di TV con l'Alaska, figurati, comunque raccontami.
Mm-hmm. Oh, get to hear a little Italian there from Hugo. That's fun. Okay.
But that's the problem. You see, that's the real problem. And you know, they've got to get rid of these things. And, you know, they got to figure out how to, you know.
Questo mettiti d'accordo con Pietro, penso lo possa stampare lui.
Hey, Hugo.
Who are you talking to?
Put your mic on mute. Put your mic on mute.
Deciderà Pietro, dai, tanto noi siamo fatto che si doveva fare. Okay. Vai in Marocco tranquillo.
That's hilarious. Okay.
This is what collapse looks like.
Yeah, it's you know, yeah, we you know, I think anybody who understands the dynamics, the debt dynamics here, and takes one look at any of these graphs, can see the exponential curve, and you know, whether it's the federal deficit or, you know, a worldwide debt or any of those things, they're all rocketing upwards, and it's just obvious that, you know, it's never going to get paid off. But of course, all you hear from the politicians is the repetitive comment that, you know, growth, a return to growth is what's going to, you know, repair our problems. And when you look at the projections that are made for Greece in terms of, you know, how they're going to pay off their debt in the future by 2050 or 2060 or whatever, it's all by projecting 3.5% growth per year from now ad infinitum.
Well, they can't do it.
It's not going to happen, right? So, you know,
growth is borrowed too.
Yeah, so it's a projection of growth, infinite growth in a finite world, which of course is the subject of Gail's blog. So Gail, you've got to have some thoughts on that type of thought process that's going on in political level and so forth. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, clearly infinite growth in a finite world is not possible, and that's exactly what we're up against. And the weakest members are the ones that tend to get pushed aside, and Greece and such are ones that are the weak members. I think one thought I had when you were talking about the banks earlier is what tends to happen with all of this when they are using high-cost energy is that you have a lot of unprofitable operations. And when you have a lot of unprofitable operations, that leads to loans that cannot be repaid. So that may very well be the source of these loans that got rolled over and extended and pretended and all of these things. So that may partly be what's rolling into this additional debt, is they're trying to hide what happened in the past, that they really, you know, where there was, if there were profits, these problems would go away. But when there aren't profits, then you have this problem that the government doesn't get enough funding, nobody gets enough funding, and the whole thing continues to be a real problem, and it explodes. I guess the other point I was going to make, I don't know if you can still hear me, is that pensions are not considered part of the debt. At least most of the government-funded pension plans are not part of the debt. But all of the European countries have pension plans that are really unsustainable. And we only find out about it first amongst Greece, but we can move to other countries and run into the same problem.
Yeah, that's the issue of unfunded liabilities, which of course is not strictly a European problem. I think most people know in the fascist states of America here about the problems with funding the Social Security program and the Medicare program, Obamacare, etc. All of those promises that have been made to the public and that people sort of expect to be upheld over time are one by one being eviscerated. And I mean, in Greece, what it boils down to is a widow's pension check that was supposed to be 1,200 euro or something like that originally has already been cut to 600 euro. And now, of course, with the capital controls and all the rest of that, she's standing on kilometer long, I'll use the European measure, kilometer long queue to collect, maybe 100 euros of her 500 euro a month allotment. So, those social promises that have been made are one by one being broken to the lowest and weakest class of society, while at the same time the opposite is true going on at the highest end of the society. The people in control of the credit creation, the bankers and so forth, continue to issue themselves enormous bonuses. The difference in the distribution of wealth between the highest 1% of any nation and the other 99% continues to diverge on a greater and greater basis all the time, and this produces, of course, more and more social strife all the time. And again, Greece presents itself as the canary in the coal mine on that issue, and we get to witness in Greece what is probably coming down the pipe just about everywhere over time. And this again brings in the question that is the most difficult, I think, when we talk about these things on the in our sphere of the blogosphere, which is trying to pick out a timeline. And okay, we see Greece is between a rock and a hard place now,
Well,
and
Greece wasn't really the first to default.
what?
In the finance crisis, Ecuador was the first. They defaulted in 2008.
Well, you could go back to Argentina in
Well,
2001 there.
basically they defaulted again, but then Iceland defaulted in there in 2009. And Ecuador was not a problem. They defaulted and got away with it. And then Iceland, it turns out, has gotten away with it. They did all the things that the Greeks are thinking about. The first thing they did, and probably one of the reasons why there's so much backstabbing and vindictiveness in the politics, is that I think the bankers are afraid that if somebody goes down the road, you got a government like Syriza, what they're going to do is they're going to hold the bankers accountable and start throwing these guys in prison. So they did that in Iceland. They just did, and they didn't pay off the, they just simply said, forget about it. We're not going to pay these things. Some of them they paid, but they didn't bend over backwards to accommodate the banking regime. And, they, of course, they have their own currency and they depreciated it. And so far they seem to have survived. It's not perfect, but people in countries like Greece and Italy, Portugal, particularly the ones that have endured abuse at the hands of the troika. The main countries would be Ireland and Portugal and Spain. Have done everything that the bankers asked them to do. That basically the governments are servants of the banking, and they're corrupt governments as well, or they're technocrats. They're busy, doing every kind of outrage. And they've done all these things, and they say, well, things haven't gotten better. They just keep getting worse. Maybe we ought to try something different besides just rolling over for the banks, with debts keep getting bigger and bigger, because, bailout is just another loan. And, a country like Iceland looks like a, pretty good bet, at least compared to, the misery that, you play along with the program, and that's what the people say in Greece. It's like, this is what I get from the blog. We keep doing this, but, we go along with the program. We go along the program, we just guarantee we're going to be in recession for another 5 years, or we'll never get out of it with lazy things. And they're right, but they're never going to get out of it anyway. It's an energy problem, not a finance problem.
Right. It's a lose-lose situation for the Greeks, no matter what.
So here's the thing.
Other
I'll just say this
other
and
than
shut up.
other than
Let
starting
me
to.
just say this and shut up. The Greeks are making a choice. They're saying, we're going to keep the status quo. We want the cars and the real estate and villas, and we want all of this heavy bullshit, industrial stuff. And we're going to sacrifice our children, our grandchildren, our working people, our elderly. They're going to take it in the neck so that we can have lifestyle. And that's not being discussed, but that's really what's happening. And the choice is, at some point, is going to say, well, we'll jettison the lifestyle because we got all the infrastructure to live comfortably. We got little Italian hill towns, and we got good food, we got wine, we got Dolce Vita. We don't really need all this shit. We can get rid of all this American-style stuff, and we can go back to, living a little bit closer to the earth and actually have a good life. It's this stuff. This is what costed all the money. It's causing all the trouble. It's like all this development is what's costs all this money. So.
Well, there's a lot of issues to debate in that, in terms of the actual ability of these cultures and these countries, given their current populations, on how much of their food they'll actually be able to produce once they do drop themselves off the industrial economy. What condition is the land in, and what condition is the environment in for growing the amount of food that they need. And then there's all the other products too. It's not just a question of food. You've got to get whole industries going, producing fibers from plants to make clothing and the like. And so divesting yourself of the industrial economy on a rapid timeline is an extraordinarily difficult thing to do. Even those of us who try to do it on the small scale.
Like Portugal had a textile industry. It was a textile manufacturer and supplier for the rest of Europe. And then they have the Eurozone. The whole thing opens up to China. So right now, the Portugal textile industry vanished, just like all the other, except for the high-end stuff, like in France and Italy, But even those guys are having problems competing with the Chinese, because everything is a matter of price now. And quality doesn't matter. All that matters is price. And this is a problem in Greece. They're competing with the Chinese too. It's like they're between a rock and a hard place. It's like they can't become more competitive, because who are they going to compete with? After China, there's Vietnam. After that, there's Sri Lanka. After that, there's Uganda. There's always some country at the edge of absolute destitution that will do absolutely anything to have an export business. And there's no way that a European country is going to compete with that. When people say competitive, what they're doing is they're saying we're impoverishing. What we're going to do is we're going to rip these people off. We're going to steal everything that isn't bolted down. We're going to take it. Then we're going to, fuck you. We don't care about you. You're a loser, and we're the winners. We're in control. And it's a very ugly sort of, political kind of thing that comes out of this. All this talk about competitiveness, all this, restructuring the economy. You're going to restructure the economy anyway, but you don't know what it's going to turn into. You wind up at Greece turning into Syria, and because there's a lot of people that are frustrated. They're not just going to take it anymore. You're like, if I get this to work here, you're that far away. There's been centuries of war in Europe, and it's a lot more serious stress now than there has been at other times in history. 10 to 30 years war was just over Catholics and Protestants. You didn't have people, begging in the streets like you do right now. I could tell you there's a lot of people right now that pick up the gun right now and raise hell because they're not getting, not necessarily the good life, but they're going to have a decent life at all. They want to have a future, and if they don't get it, they're going to do like all these kids in North Africa and Middle East. You know, they just go out there and raise hell.
All right, Steve. That was a heck of a rant. I think, I agree with just about all of it. It's a clusterfuck. So I'd like to give Hugo a chance to bring us back to a more calm, maybe.
Calm. You think I'm calm?
Or pick up
What's
on it,
happening?
Hugo.
You're telling me that
Yeah.
I'm calm?
Feel free to rant
Are you
also.
kidding? I mean, do you see the mess we are in? It's a disaster. This is the end of Europe. Not as a geological thing, as a union. There used to be a union, a European Union. Damn it! It was a beautiful dream. You remember 70 years ago, Europeans were shooting at each other, killing each other, and now we said, okay, we get together, we form a union, and we show to this stupid world that we can make a nation without shooting each other. Now, look how these idiots, they destroyed the dream. How do you say that? Death of a dream. This is Europe. This is serious. I mean, take a look to these people in Brussels. I'm not making names. Just look at their faces. I mean, how could they botch it so much? This is unbelievable.
Yeah,
I mean, it's such a thing as keeping together a nation. Europe is a nation. And you have Mrs. Merkel doing that? I mean, that's not possible. That's not it. The hell with that. Let me not say anything, but these people are evil, stupid morons, feeble-minded, lizard people, aliens, child eaters, or whatever you have. I mean, I'm stopping here because I would say more than that.
The level.
You told me that I had to be calm, and I'm calm.
Okay, that's the calm version, right?
Yeah, this is the calm version of me.
Hasn't lost his temper yet, and that's good.
No, not at all.
Yeah, the deal is that it's greed. Greed basically has almost run the world since time immemorial, and the control aspects, control freaks, who pull the levers and pull the strings of government and pull the monetary strings that control that government, have worked these things to their own advantage for so many years that I think they have lost perspective on what they're doing, and the fact that they're basically pissing in their own backyard or whatever, however you want to put it. They're just making a bigger and bigger mess with every cycle. Every solution that they come up with has blowback that provides still more problems. But of course, they try to offload the problems to somebody else, to a weaker nation. And this, of course, then forces the immigration problems. And you talk about Italy turning into another Syria. Well, that's going to happen. But you know what's going to happen first? Italy's going to get loaded with Syrians because they're all trying to get out of Syria and shipping themselves over on little boats and landing on the Italian shore. And so you've got this wicked immigration problem that's going on all over the world as people try to escape the problem countries and the places where there is absolutely no economic opportunity anymore, and trying to get to countries where they perceive that they might have some economic opportunity. There's an evacuation going on right now out of Puerto Rico because those people now sense that there's no future for them in Puerto Rico. And of course, being a part of the Commonwealth, they can come over to the United States just as they did in the 1930s and 1940s, which is how we ended up with such a large Puerto Rican population in New York City. For those of you who ever watched West Side Story, that's a great movie about that. I want to live in America, welfare is free in America, etc. Anyway, So that's why singing is not my teacher. Okay, so Gail, you haven't pitched in a while. I think you usually have a rather calm demeanor, so I don't know if you'll join the ranting party. But any thoughts on all these various aspects, the immigration problems that are coming out, and so forth, on all of
Asking
these?
me, ask me.
Yeah, I'm on
No,
Gail now.
Gail.
Gail
Gail.
hasn't
Gail,
Gail
yeah,
hasn't
yeah.
had
No.
a chance in a
Well, I
while.
think, as long as you have plenty of cheap energy and that cheap energy is growing and it can be shared amongst the other countries, this is the perfect setup for European Union, for bigger groups, the IMF, all of these big organizations to grow around the world. But as you get a shrinkage of energy and as it becomes higher price to produce, and now, as we're finding it harder to keep the price up high enough for those producers to continue producing, you get lots more stresses. And when we went to a level of more and more aggregation, we go to more and more level of disaggregation. And as you pointed out too, there's this population problem. No matter what kind of problem is, whether it's California has no water, or Syria has way too much war, or Greece can't pay its pensions, you can believe there are going to be people moving to other parts of the Eurozone if that's allowed. Any kind of a situation, even if it's not allowed, they're going to find ways to get on a little boat to go someplace where they can have a better life. We've seen that since the beginning of time, that people have migrated. So I think that that's the direction we have to expect as we're getting closer to limits. The tendency towards aggregation goes to a tendency towards breaking up into smaller pieces again.
Yeah, I call that the breakup of the one to the many, and I think most people see it now. You of course saw it early on in this ball game with the breakup of the old Soviet Union. That was an example of a large conglomeration that no longer, once the pressure was put on, no longer could afford to maintain all the systems and so forth, to maintain a very large organization and large system. So, and we talk about, solutions to the problem, and, if we're, let's try to leave on a little bit of an up note. I know we all understand the depth of the problems here, but all of us have our hopes and dreams for means and methods that can, if not prevent all the problems that we're seeing right now, perhaps at least these solutions might ameliorate them. Steve talked a little bit about moving back to more of an 18th century lifestyle, living a little closer to the land and so forth. Hugo, I know you have interest in renewables, photovoltaics, and so forth. You wrote a recent article about Italy and their attempt to move more into renewable energy. You want to talk a little bit about that before we leave for the day?
That's the hope. We have to restart from the beginning because the European Union was a disaster, and we had to rebuild it from scratch. And one way to rebuild a nation, as Gail said, if you have energy, then you can do things. If you don't have energy, you can only run away if you can. So we are seeing an attempt to rebuild the structure, the infrastructure of society, the industrial infrastructure, the way things are made, the way things are transported, the transportation system, and to create a sort of Mediterranean renewable energy pool, if I can use this term. I mean, all the Mediterranean regions of Europe have been building up a solid renewable energy infrastructure up to a certain point. Then they sort of got cold feet because indeed it was expensive. The way it had been created was expensive. But the interesting thing is that, there was this big burst of photovoltaic energy because it was paid by the government. then the governments realized that they were paying a lot of money for photovoltaics, so I said, stop that. But my gosh, let's not do that anymore. Let's hope that photovoltaic will die. But the interesting thing is that it didn't die. The government stopped subsidizing photovoltaics, and photovoltaics is alive and well, incredibly, at least in Italy. But even in Greece, it is doing reasonably well. In Italy, we are getting close to 1 million photovoltaic plants in the whole country, which is a large number of plants. Once you have 1 million plants, it is not something for a few eccentric green types. It starts being something diffused in the fabric of society. If you have 1 million plants, it's normal. It's like having cars. We have many more than 1 million, but 1 million of anything is a large number. So I think,
except for $1 million, that's a very
$1
small
million
number.
is not. I wish I had more, something like that. But anyway, it would not be so small for me. But it is small. I understand. And so I think a ray of hope is coming from that direction. If we can rebuild our infrastructure and reduce our terrible dependency of imports of natural resources, then we have a hope to adapt. This is not a problem that we can solve, because it's impossible to solve. It's a change. Problems you can solve. Changes you can adapt to. And this is what I see, a beam of hope, a glimmer of hope, something that's happening here, but it is a little bit late, unfortunately. Should have started earlier on.
Yeah, you need to go back probably at least to the 70s. I think some people think if we had just got started in maybe 2000 or whatever, and instead of going down this route of throwing good money after bad and pursuing endless growth and all the rest of that, started to address the problems then, maybe that would have been early enough or late enough, however you want to look at it. But I think you really have to go back a significant amount of time. And then there's all sorts of sociological and thermodynamic questions, which I try to address all the time on the diner, with respect to what drives society and what drives people towards what appear to be some extremely bad choices. And even though we may inherently know that, nobody seems to have enough control over the system as a whole to be able to change the path that the society as a whole is taking. And so this is a very intractable problem overall. Steve, let me give you another chance to rant and maybe tell us some hopeful things that you see for the future.
I mean, there's as long as there's, I guess there's always some hope, but I don't really spend a lot of time thinking about hope, because you have a different set of alternative outcomes. Most of the outcomes, if there's one thing in common with all the outcomes, it's less. And hope tends to be one of these things that needs more. So we've been living in more, a world of more. For our everybody here has been living in a world of more for going back generations, and this is what we're used to. We automatically think in terms of more, and over the past few years, we're kind of in this transition phase, and I tell people it began in 1998. That's when peak oil was, in my opinion, and we're in a situation now where the operative, kind of like the major trend is less. We're going to have to figure out how to deal with less, and there's ways to do it, but we have to learn how to do it, and we have to approach the whole problem right from the beginning. It's like, this is something that we have to do, and if we don't manage the whole business of less properly, it's going to be, things are just going to get worse because less is going to happen whether we do something about it or not. Now, if we're sensible, and I think we're sensible enough that we can do steps so that we can adjust ourselves for a world of less resources, less credit, maybe less intrusiveness, not necessarily from the government, but, we're bombarded with, marketing messages all the time. And I think it makes people a little bit crazy. I think a lot of what's happening. And people are starting to push back on that. So I think if there's anything that's hopeful, it's, we're kind of like, by the most roundabout way possible, is trying to come to terms with a new world. We really know the vaguest outlines of. And they say Americans don't do anything until there's bodies in the streets. And of course, once there's bodies in the streets, and people say that's the wrong reason for there's bodies in the streets, but eventually they'll figure it out. So I think if that's probably the most hopeful thing I can say. We're inching, groping in some sort of direction. And I think it may wind up, one way or the other, we're going to have to deal with it.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. There's an inevitability here to this, thermodynamic driver that you simply can't work your way around. And it's a law, a natural law, a physical law, and it is a demonstrated fact that all living things need a thermodynamic gradient, and we're working along a very large one, or have been, through the age of oil, and even before that, coal, and even before that, peat and whatnot, and agriculture, in terms of being at even Steven, or pay as you go as a species, with respect to the energy input we take versus how much we use and how much comes in from the sun. It's been probably since hunter-gatherer days that we really were in balance with the overall thermodynamic gradient that we have access to. Right now, we've been living on millions and millions of years of stored fossil fuels, stored solar energy in those fuels to maintain a lifestyle that is just far and above what can be maintained in perpetuity. So, Gail, I'd like to give you a chance to talk about some hopeful things that perhaps you see as possible in the future, even if they're not likely. What directions you would like to see taken here to try to make things a little bit better?
Well, I think anything that is hopeful for the future, as we're talking, has to be kind of short-term, kind of hopeful. Because I think you were saying it's only since hunter-gatherer times that we've been, overusing our share of resources. I've been saying the reverse. We go back all the way to hunter-gatherer times. That was when we started using more than our share of resources. In fact, that's how we moved away from being how we grew our population back then. We learned how to cook our food. We learned how to control fire way back then. And we learned how to heat so that we could move to warmer climates. So we've been growing over a very long time, and this is what has put us on this path, which is very hard to get out of. So I guess all I can see is short-term moves. So the kind of short-term moves, I think one of the things Greece is looking at is lignite. It's not that we need more energy, it's we need cheap energy. And, kidding ourselves that we can borrow huge amounts of money to build a solar PV system, I don't see it doing enough relative to the amount of additional debt that it puts us into, that it gets us where you need to be. If lignite can be done cheaply enough, maybe it can help get part out of the hole that Greece is in. I think the other thing is what you mentioned earlier about, people move everywhere. Well, I think what tends to happen, will happen here again, is people will start moving out from the countries that have the most problems, and they'll try to move to countries that have a little bit more energy. Of course, that's not going to make the other countries real happy, and it will push further towards, we don't really want to be one Europe. We don't really want to let, the people, if people from Italy start moving to France or Germany, they're not going to be greatly welcome there. I understand France has problems too, and, nobody is going to be very happy about people moving in from elsewhere just because conditions are better. But I think that's traditionally been what's happened, is you get people moving to try to even out differences.
Getting back to the migration problem and so forth that accrues from basically the economic difficulties, but exacerbated tremendously by the climate problems that are hitting so many places. We talked earlier in the broadcast about the current heat wave ongoing in Europe. Everybody is pretty aware of the California drought. Now another city is in the race to be the first one abandoned. Durban, South Africa, is under severe water restrictions, so add them to the list with Sao Paulo and Las Vegas and Phoenix and Los Angeles and probably half a dozen other cities, smaller cities that we don't know about or hear about on a regular basis that are struggling with the issues of water in an increasingly dry situation in many places, with increasingly more people and more utilization of the water through agriculture and the rest. And then, you talk about the possibility of using lignite as a energy bridge for the Greeks, a cheaper form of energy. Well, cheaper in one respect, that maybe you can pull it in for more money, but more expensive from the point of view that you got to burn a whole lot more lignite to get the same number of BTUs as you do oil, and that's putting more CO2 up in the atmosphere, of course. So there's blowback. There's blowback from trying to use lignite too, and then what happens? You get an atmosphere like you get in Beijing, right? With people choking and then increased medical problems that result from that. I know the rates of lung disease and so forth in China have increased exponentially over the last decade. I was reading about that in one story. So there's all sorts of costs that you have here that are involved. And in the end, whether it was in hunter-gatherer times, as I contend, or as or after hunter-gatherer times, or as Gail contends, prior to hunter-gatherer times. Let me just say why I believe that, to answer Gail. And the true energy-intensive processes were not the burning of wood for cooking food or heating homes or any of that stuff. The wood, the fuel grows back basically as fast as you burn it for those purposes. They're not tremendously energy intensive. What's energy intensive are two things that came early on, just at the beginning of agriculture, and that is metallurgy and ceramics. If you've seen either one of them, you know the tremendous amount of heat that is required to smelt metal out of ore and to take glass. If you ever looked inside a glass furnace, you know how hot that is to get glass to melt and to purify it and so forth. So these were enormously energy-intensive processes that led to agriculture. The pots and the ceramics that they were able to make allowed for the storage of grains and so forth. The metal implements that were possible allowed for the type of agricultural processes that we see today. Prior to that, hunter-gatherers did a form of agriculture, horticulture. They would purposefully plant things and whatnot and come back later for them, but they didn't do the same type of energy intensive and land stripping, soil stripping ag that came later on. So it's my belief, and I mean, it's a belief. I can't establish it on pure scientific principles, but it's my belief that the hunter-gatherer lifestyle was pay-as-you-go, and that it was energy sustainable overall. But again, it's just a difference of opinion between me and Gail, and it's my show. I get the last word. Anyway, we have the Greek situation that is dynamic and is going to have major effects over the next week, in my opinion, on the global markets. There is no obvious resolution as of yet. In fact, nobody's even talking to each other as of yet. In terms of the hand that the Greeks have, that Tsipras has, in terms of his ability to negotiate with the banks and with Brussels. It probably is strengthened somewhat by this vote. He has now a mandate from the Greek people to reject what went down, and the European side of this is going to try to make a case that this is a choice of the Greek people to leave the European Union, but in fact it's not. And there is no legal means for the Greeks to be kicked out of the European Union. So they are really at a legal and moral impasse here, and something's got to give, and something will. But we just don't know what it is exactly, and how it's going to play out. And that is why Gail and Steve and Hugo and myself and many others are here on the net. We're observers of this phenomenon. We are trying to deliver information that you don't necessarily hear about in the mainstream media, and it's an effort on all our parts to make sense of what often seems a very insensible and, in fact, insane situation. And I hope to be here with you again. I hope to be here with my friends, Hugo, Steve, and Gail, and others, to continue this. We hope the internet does not go dark anytime in the near future, so we can continue to help everybody understand these issues as they go down. And that's all the doom this time until next time, here on the Collapse Cafe. See you later, Doomers.